In this video, I'm going to make 2 easy puzzles that would be perfect holiday gifts for those little ones in your life. A personalized shape puzzle and a 6-sided block puzzle. Let's start with the easier one first. I raided my scrap bin and found some 1/2-inch plywood that would be perfect for this puzzle. I printed out these shapes and then cut them out. I used some spray adhesive and placed the shapes where I thought they would look good, and you can find all these templates on my website. So off camera, I cut the board to rough length and then drilled a hole in each shape to make room for a jigsaw blade. I really wish that I had a scroll saw for work like this because I feel like the cuts would be a lot cleaner. But I was able to get pretty decent results with a scrolling blade in my jigsaw. The cuts were okay, but they're just still jigsaw cuts. Nothing a Dremel with a sanding attachment can't fix. After all those cutouts were cleaned up, I found some scrap hardwood that I could use for the puzzle pieces. This is walnut and maple, and I thought it would be fun if I did an alternating pattern with 2 colors. So I traced the shapes onto the wood, then cut the shapes out with the bandsaw, and then cleaned up all those bandsaw cuts with some sanding off camera. I wanted to personalize this puzzle with pictures that were special to my family, so I printed out 6 pictures, then cut them out to be slightly larger than each of the shapes in the puzzle and began the glue up. For the bottom, I cut another piece of 1/2-inch ply to roughly the same size as the top piece. And when putting glue on the top piece, I made sure there was enough all around the edges, but I didn't want any glue to be right next to the shapes because I didn't want the glue to squeeze out onto the pictures. So I lowered the top piece down a bit and just placed each picture down. I actually forgot to use some spray adhesive on them. I would totally recommend using some of that. So it wasn't important if the top and bottom pieces were lined up with each other because I'm going to trim them to final size later. It was just important that all the pictures were centered. Once dry, I could trim it to final width at the table saw and then to final length at the miter saw. The pictures need to be sealed before use, so I mixed up some tabletop epoxy and poured a really small amount into each one of the shapes, just enough to coat the picture. Then I popped any air bubbles with a torch and set it off to cure. After final sanding, I finished the rest of the puzzle with some food-safe mineral oil, and this puzzle is done. On to the next puzzle, the 6-sided puzzle. So I cut up some 1/4 ash to rough length and squared up one edge at the table saw using my jointer jig. I wanted to make cubes for this puzzle, meaning all of the sides need to be exactly the same. So I used the thickness of the ash blank as a referential measurement for how wide to cut the blank into strips. Then I squared up one end of all the strips on my crosscut sled, and then I set up my stop block to the width of those strips and cut them into 16 evenly sized cubes. So as you can see from my getup, winter weather is fast approaching, which means that your tools and equipment might get rusty if stored improperly, like these snips that were left in my garage. An easy way to prevent rust before storing your equipment is to spray the metal parts with WD-40 Specialist Long-Term Corrosion Inhibitor. Spraying this on metal parts that remain outside, like my basketball hoop, swing set, or sawbuck, will block corrosion for up to 1 year. If you sprayed on metal that's stored inside, like my number punches or pressure washer, it stays where you spray it for up to 2 years. So taking a few moments out of your day to prevent rust definitely beats having to remove rust in the future. Thank you WD-40 for sponsoring this video. Back to the puzzle. I laid out all the cubes in a random pattern, putting 4 in each row. Then I used some cawls and clamps around the edges to squeeze all the cubes together. My daughter helped me design the different images that would go on this puzzle, and then I printed them out and used some spray adhesive to temporarily attach them. And I just tried my best to follow the lines on the paper with my router. I thought that it would be a good idea to keep the paper on these pieces for the next step, so I used an X-Acto knife to separate them, keeping the paper intact, and then I just repeated the same process for the next image. I am not really the best at using my router freehand like this, so some of the images look a little more handmade than others, but it's all just part of the fun, and this puzzle was just an experiment for an idea that I had rolling around in my head, and in the end, I'm not really sure that routing out the design was the best idea, but I didn't realize this just yet, so I repeated the process 4 more times, and then they were all ready for paint. Each side of the puzzle gets a different color, so you know which side of the puzzle you're working on. Otherwise, it would be an impossible puzzle. After the paint dried, I peeled off the paper and clamped them up to sand all the excess paint off of each side. I actually don't think using spray paint was the best idea. It was too messy, and I should have just hand painted in the grooves. I also should have filled in the grooves with epoxy, or maybe skip the grooves altogether and just hand paint the design straight onto the blocks. Regardless, I went way too deep with the grooves, so I chamfered all sides of the cubes to sort of blend in where those grooves were meeting in the corners. Moving on, I made a quick little tray that will hold all the cubes. Nothing fancy here, just butt joints, glue, and brads with a plywood bottom. I sanded all of the edges smooth and finished it like I did the other puzzle with a food safe finish because it's for kids. And it's done. So I had this 6-sided puzzle idea floating around in my head for a while, and it was really fun to experiment with it. It definitely needs some improvement in the execution, but I think the basic idea is cool. Painting each side of the puzzle in a specific color makes it easier to do each side. Without the individual colors, this puzzle would really be impossible. And like I mentioned before, I think there are some better alternatives to make this puzzle. One way would be just to hand paint the images onto the wood without using a router. But I'm really glad that I tested this out. Even if you do choose to use a router, don't go as deep as I did. I went like a little less than an eighth, go really, really shallow. Another idea would be to have your kids color on the paper printouts and cut out the printouts into squares and then permanently glue those onto the cubes. There's always different options, just the basic idea is there. And I think that this personalized shape puzzle is super cute. I know that my kids would have loved this when they were little. It would be really sweet to put pictures of grandparents or aunts and uncles and cousins in the shapes. I just love how customizable and personalized it is. So I hope you guys enjoyed this and it gives you some ideas for some quick holiday gifts that you can make for those little cuties in your life. Thank you guys so much for watching and happy holidays.
This one looks like a basketball.
Interesting.
This one looks like a heart. These one looks like wheat thingies.
Wheat thingies?
Yep.
What would you think?
That one looks like a soccer ball.
Do you see any differences in any of them?
Yeah.
What?
They're all like different.
Different what?
They're all different like colors and shapes.
Oh, so maybe if you like turn them all to one color, you can figure something out.
Maybe. This one looks orange because that one looks like the sports set.
Okay.
That one looks like a football. That's like a soccer. That's like a basketball.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's like a puzzle. It's starting to come together. This is a hard puzzle you put together, Mom.
Mm-hmm. Ta-da!